Let me start with something that will ruin everything you think you know about Napoleon Bonaparte. He wasn't short. Napoleon stood 5 feet 6 inches tall. In the context of early 19th century France, that was average. Perfectly, unremarkably average. The men around him were not taller. He was not looking up at his generals. The image you have in your head, the small bitter man compensating for his size with conquest, is a lie. A piece of British wartime propaganda so effective that it survived 2 centuries and became historical fact. Think about that. The most powerful man in the world was successfully humiliated by a cartoon. And he never recovered from it. Not because it hurt his feelings, but because Napoleon Bonaparte was a man who had constructed an image of himself so total, so absolute, so carefully architected, that any crack in it, no matter how small, threatened to collapse the entire structure. Because the structure wasn't built on stone. It was built on something far more fragile. It was built on his own mind. To understand Napoleon's psychology, you first have to understand where he came from. He was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, a backwater territory that had just been sold to France by Genoa 1 year before his birth. He wasn't even French by origin. He was Corsican, a foreigner, an outsider in the country he would one day crown himself emperor of. He was sent to military school in France at 9 years old, alone, unable to speak French properly, mocked by his classmates for his accent, his poverty, his island origins. Psychologists have studied what happens to highly intelligent children who are isolated, humiliated, and surrounded by people who underestimate them. The brain does one of 2 things. It breaks, or it builds a fortress. Napoleon's brain built a fortress. And inside that fortress, he constructed an alternative reality, one where he was not the poor Corsican boy struggling with French grammar, one where he was not the outsider being laughed at, one where he was, and this is not a metaphor, this is clinical, destined for greatness, chosen, different from other human beings in a way that was not just significant but cosmic. Psychologists call this a compensatory grandiose self, a psychological structure built specifically to protect a fragile core identity from the damage of early humiliation. It is extraordinarily common in people who achieve world historical levels of power. It is also extraordinarily dangerous, because a compensatory grandiose self doesn't just believe it is great, it needs to prove it, constantly, insatiably, to everyone, forever. By his mid-20s, Napoleon had already done something that should have been impossible. He had risen from obscure foreign nobody to the most celebrated military commander in France. He had no connections, no family money, no political allies. What he had instead was something his contemporaries found genuinely unsettling, an almost inhuman capacity to see military situations in 3 dimensions while everyone else was still thinking in 2. He didn't just win battles. He fundamentally changed how battles were fought. He moved armies faster than anyone thought physically possible. He attacked where nobody expected an attack. He made decisions in minutes that his opponents spent hours agonizing over. And with every victory, something happened inside his psychology that should concern us. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel gratitude. He didn't feel satisfied. He felt confirmation. Each battlefield victory wasn't a success. It was proof. Proof of what he had always believed about himself. Proof that he was different. Proof that ordinary rule of warfare, of politics, of human limitation, simply did not apply to him the way they applied to everyone else. This is the psychological signature of a God complex in its early stages. This goes beyond confidence or arrogance. Those words are too small for what Napoleon carried inside him. What he had was something more specific and more dangerous, the genuine, deeply held belief that you exist outside the normal constraints of human experience. By 1804, Napoleon had gone from military commander to first consul of France. And first consul wasn't enough. He wanted to be emperor. But here is the moment that tells you everything about his psychology. When the time came to be crowned Emperor of the French, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and crowned himself. The Pope, the most powerful religious authority in the Western world, the man who represented the literal voice of God on earth, had traveled all the way to Paris for this ceremony. He was sitting right there. His entire purpose was to place the crown on Napoleon's head. That was the tradition. That was the protocol. That was how it had been done for 1,000 years. Napoleon looked at him, took the crown, and put it on his own head. He didn't need God's representative to make him emperor. He was his own authority. Think about what that gesture communicated. Not just to the room, to himself. Napoleon wasn't just rejecting papal authority. He was making a statement about the nature of his own power that went beyond politics, beyond religion, beyond any conventional framework of human achievement. He wasn't crowned by God, he crowned himself. And in that single moment, you can see the full architecture of his psychology laid bare. Now here is where it gets clinically interesting. Napoleon's God complex wasn't simply about power. Power was almost beside the point. What Napoleon craved, with an intensity that his closest advisors found exhausting and frightening, was something more specific. He craved the rewriting of reality itself. French reality, European reality, the entire map of the known world. Nothing was outside the scope of what he believed he could rewrite. He redesigned the legal system. The Napoleonic Code, still the basis of law in dozens of countries today. He redesigned education. He redesigned the church's relationship with the state. He redesigned the map of Europe, literally, physically, redrawing borders and installing his own family members as kings of countries that had existed for centuries. Governing implies responding to a world that already exists. Napoleon had no interest in that world. He was building a new one from scratch. Psychologists who have studied Napoleon's correspondence, and he wrote obsessively, sometimes dictating dozens of letters before breakfast, find a consistent pattern that is deeply revealing. He almost never describes reacting to events. He describes creating them. In his own mind, Napoleon was not a man responding to the world around him. He was a man generating the world around him. That distinction is not semantic. It is the psychological difference between a leader and something else entirely. Something that doesn't have a comfortable name in polite conversation. But here is the paradox at the heart of Napoleon's psychology. And it is a paradox that his biographers have circled for 2 centuries without quite landing on. The God complex that made him unstoppable also made him catastrophically blind. Because gods don't need to listen. Gods don't need advisors. Gods don't need to consider the possibility that they are wrong. Gods don't need to factor in winter. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with the largest army ever assembled in European history. 600,000 men. His generals advised against it. His diplomats warned him. Basic military logic. The Russian winter. The impossibility of supply lines across that distance. The scorched earth strategy the Russians would employ. All of it was visible, obvious, available to anyone who looked. Napoleon didn't look. Not because he was stupid. He was one of the most intelligent military minds in recorded history, but because looking would have required acknowledging a constraint, and constraints were for ordinary men. By the time he retreated from Moscow, he had lost more than 400,000 soldiers. To cold, to starvation, to a reality that didn't care about his self-image. Reality never does. There's a specific term in clinical psychology, anosognosia. It describes a condition where a person is genuinely, neurologically unable to perceive their own deficit. Not unwilling, unable. Napoleon's psychological anosognosia wasn't neurological, but it was functionally identical. He could not perceive the gap between who he believed himself to be and what the world was actually telling him. His enemies didn't bring him down. The Russian winter didn't break him. The coalition of European powers closing in from every direction wasn't what finished him. After Russia, after the catastrophic losses, after exile to Elba, he escaped, raised another army, marched on Paris, was defeated finally and absolutely at Waterloo. And even then, even exiled to St. Helena, a tiny island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from everything he had built, he spent his final years dictating his memoirs, still controlling the story, still authoring the final version of himself for posterity. A man exiled to a rock in the middle of the ocean, and his primary concern was how history would remember him. He died in 1821. His final words, by most accounts, were France, Army, Josephine. 3 nouns. The things he had loved, the things he had lost, the things that had been real. So what do we make of Napoleon Bonaparte? A god complex of this magnitude doesn't appear from nowhere. It is built carefully, painfully over years, by a mind trying to survive something it couldn't survive any other way. The 9-year-old boy on that French military school playground, being laughed at for his accent, couldn't have known that the fortress he was building inside his own mind would one day reshape the entire world. He also couldn't have known that the same walls keeping the pain out were keeping the truth out too. That is the final psychological verdict on Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest military genius in modern history, brought down by the gap between the man he believed he was and the man he actually was. That gap, that single, invisible, catastrophic gap, is where empires go to die. I'm Dark Throne Minds. Every week we go inside the minds of history's most powerful, most dangerous, and most psychologically fascinating figures. Next week, Joseph Stalin, a man so consumed by paranoia that he couldn't trust a single person alive, and made the entire Soviet Union pay for it. Subscribe, turn on notifications. The history books left out the best parts. We'll find them.